Racist cop arrests black man, unknowingly detaining a general in disguise. Michael Johnson felt the weight of the handcuffs on his wrists as he walked down the cold hallway of the administrative building. The misunderstanding had started just 15 minutes earlier, but it already felt like an eternity. His mind raced, trying to process how a simple inspection visit had turned into this nightmare. The security guard, Richard Thompson, nudged him lightly from behind with the arrogance of someone who believed they had caught a criminal red-handed. Michael tried once more to explain who he really was, but his words fell on deaf ears. With every step, the situation grew more absurd, and he knew his true identity, once revealed, would completely shift this humiliating dynamic. Michael was known across the state for his brilliant military career. At 38, he had become the youngest general in U.S. Army history, commanding one of the country's most important military bases, located near Chicago. His strategic intelligence was internationally recognized, and his dedication to honor and justice earned him respect from both subordinates and superiors. That Tuesday morning, Michael had decided to conduct a surprise inspection at the Civil Training Center, a facility that provided services to the Army. Deliberately, he chose to wear a simple civilian suit and left behind any visible military identification. He wanted to observe how civilian staff treated ordinary visitors, especially after receiving complaints about racial discrimination at the facility. Richard Thompson, on the other hand, was a 42-year-old man who had worked as the security chief of the complex for nearly 10 years. He came from a traditional family in the area, where prejudices were masked under layers of formality and technical justifications. His worldview was shaped by stereotypes he rarely questioned, and his position of authority fed an ego that blinded him to his own flaws. When Michael entered the main building of the center that morning, Richard immediately grew suspicious. He saw a well-dressed black man walking confidently through the halls, even though Michael was impeccably dressed and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Richard couldn't see past the color of his skin. "Excuse me, sir," Richard called out, stepping forward with firm strides. "Do you have authorization to be here?" Michael stopped and turned, maintaining the calm that defined his personality. His eyes, trained to assess complex situations in seconds, immediately caught the thinly veiled hostility in the guard's tone. "Good morning, yes, I have authorization," Michael replied in a steady, polite voice. "I'm here for a routine inspection." "Inspection?" Richard scoffed. "You work here, I've never seen you before, and I know every authorized employee." "I don't work here specifically, but I have the authority to conduct inspections," Michael explained, still patient. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to continue my work." Michael's response, instead of reassuring Richard, only deepened his suspicion. In the guard's prejudiced mind, no black man could have the authority to inspect that facility. It had to be some kind of scam or break-in. "Authority?" Richard crossed his arms. "Then show me your official ID." Michael hesitated for a moment. Revealing his true identity would ruin the whole purpose of his surprise visit. He decided to try another approach. "My identification is being processed in the administrative department," he half-lied. "Can I continue my inspection in the meantime?" "Oh, now the story changes, huh?" Richard smiled slyly. "First you said you had authorization, now you claim you're being audited. This reeks of a scam." Michael's heart beat a little faster. He recognized that behavioral pattern of people who had already decided which narrative they wanted to believe regardless of the facts. It was the same kind of resistance he'd faced a few times during his military career, when some subordinates questioned his authority based on racial prejudice. "Sir, I ask you to be reasonable." Michael tried one last diplomatic approach. "I can call the administrative department and clear this up quickly." "No, you can't." Richard was clearly feeling in control of the situation. "You're staying right here with me until we get to the bottom of this. And by the way, how does a guy like you even get authorization to inspect a place like this?" The phrase "a guy like you" hung in the air with all the weight of its implicit bias. Michael felt a mix of indignation and sadness. As a general, he was used to the automatic respect his rank commanded. As a black man, he knew that respect sometimes vanished when his military identity wasn't known. "I suggest you reconsider your words," Michael said, his voice maintaining military firmness but with a warning tone Richard failed to interpret. "I have nothing to reconsider." Richard grew more aggressive. "You came in here without clear authorization. You're making up stories about inspections and now you want to lecture me. I think we'd better call corporate security." Michael realized the situation was escalating dangerously. His command experience had taught him to recognize when someone was beyond reason. Richard had convinced himself Michael was a threat, and no logical argument would change his perspective now. "Fine," Michael conceded momentarily. "Call whoever you think is necessary. But I must warn you, you're making a serious mistake." "Mistake?" Richard scoffed. "The only mistake here was you thinking you could fool security in this place." As Richard reached for his radio to call backup, Michael took the chance to observe his surroundings. The Civil Training Center was a modern complex, with wide hallways and architecture that showcased the institution's importance. Signs on the walls marked different departments: administration, human resources, technical training, institutional relations. Within minutes, 2 other guards arrived. Michael recognized them as similar to Richard, middle-aged men, likely locals, with that air of authority that came from years in positions of power over visitors. "What's the situation, Richard?" asked one, a bald, burly man. "This guy came in without authorization, says he has permission to inspect but can't prove anything," Richard explained, pointing at Michael as if he were an object. First he said one thing, then changed his story. "Smells like a scam." Michael kept his posture straight and dignified as the 3 men sized him up. His military mind quickly assessed his options. He could reveal his identity immediately, but that would mean admitting his surprise inspection had failed. He could also try to persuade them another way, though his experience told him men like these rarely changed their minds once convinced of something. "Gentlemen," Michael addressed the 3 with the natural authority his military position granted him, "I ask that you allow me to contact the administrative department. I'm certain this situation can be cleared up quickly." "No, it can't." The bald guard was firm. "First we verify your ID, then we'll see if you get to call anyone." "My wallet is in the inner pocket of my jacket," Michael Johnson informed. "May I get it?" The 3 men exchanged glances. Richard Thompson motioned for Michael to proceed, but remained alert, as if expecting some suspicious movement. Michael calmly retrieved his wallet and handed over his civilian ID. Purposefully, he left his military identification in the inner pocket, still hoping to resolve the situation without revealing his true role. Richard examined the document with exaggerated care, as if he were an expert at spotting forgeries. "Michael Johnson," he read aloud. "Address in Chicago. Occupation, business consultant." "Business consultant?" The bald security guard laughed. "And what kind of consulting would a business consultant be doing here?" Michael took a deep breath. His civilian ID did indeed list business consultant as his profession, a generic designation he used for non-military activities. Technically, it wasn't a lie, since the U.S. Army often called on him for advisory roles in civilian organizations. "Management and leadership consulting," Michael answered honestly. "I work with different types of organizations." "Management and leadership?" Richard returned the document with disdain. "And who hired this consulting here?" Michael realized he was being backed into a corner. Every honest answer he gave was interpreted as evasive or suspicious. These men's resistance wasn't based on legitimate security procedures, but on prejudices that prevented them from accepting that a black man could hold significant authority or professional competence. "The hiring was done through institutional channels." Michael kept his response vague, still trying to maintain the secrecy of his mission. "I can provide more details when I speak with the administration." "Institutional channels," the 3rd guard, who had remained silent until now, repeated the words mockingly. "Yeah, right, that's a poorly told story if I ever heard one." Michael began to feel a familiar sense of emotional claustrophobia. It was the same feeling he'd experienced a few times in his career when his competence was questioned not on merit, but by factors entirely beyond his control. The difference was, in those instances, his military rank quickly cleared up any misunderstanding. Now, without that protection, he was experiencing the vulnerability many black men faced daily. "Gentlemen," Michael made one last appeal to reason, I understand your concerns about the facility's security. That's exactly why I'm here. But I assure you this is a misunderstanding that can be quickly resolved. Misunderstanding? Richard was clearly irritated. The misunderstanding is you thinking you can waltz in here and feed us this nonsense. Let's settle this once and for all. Richard pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Michael couldn't hide his surprise. In his entire military career, facing real danger and tense situations, he never imagined he'd be handcuffed by civilian guards in such an absurd scenario. This is completely unnecessary, Michael protested, but kept his composure. I pose no threat, and I've been cooperating with you. Cooperating? The bald guard scoffed. You've been stringing us along for 20 minutes. Cooperating would have meant telling the truth from the start. Michael extended his wrists, deciding that physical resistance would only worsen the situation. As Richard clamped the cuffs on, Michael maintained his dignity, looking each man firmly in the eye. His military bearing remained intact, even in this humiliating position. You're making a serious mistake, Michael said calmly. And when you find out who I really am, I hope you'll have the humility to admit it. Threats now? Richard tightened the handcuffs more than necessary. This just confirms we did the right thing. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. As he was escorted down the hallway, Michael noticed the staff passing by. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with obvious discomfort. A middle-aged woman who seemed to work in administration stopped and watched the scene with a puzzled expression. Richard, what's going on? She asked. Just removing an intruder, Ms. Jennifer, Richard replied proudly. Someone trying to pass themselves off as an inspector without authorization. Jennifer, the administrative worker, studied Michael more closely. There was something about his posture, the way he held his head high, even while handcuffed, that didn't match the description of an intruder. Are you sure that's the case? Jennifer pressed. Maybe we should check with management before... Ms. Jennifer, with all due respect, security is my responsibility, Richard interrupted. He couldn't prove he had authorization to be here. Simple as that. Michael caught the hesitation in Jennifer's voice and decided to try an approach. Ma'am, my name is Michael Johnson. If you could verify my visit with Colonel Parker, I'm sure this can be cleared up. Mentioning Colonel Parker was a gamble. Michael knew the colonel was responsible for liaising between the U.S. Army and civilian institutions in the area. If Jennifer recognized the name, it might open a door to resolving the situation. Jennifer seemed to recognize it, but Richard quickly stepped in. Miss Jennifer, let's not waste time with more made-up stories, he said, pushing Michael to keep walking. We'll handle this in the security office. Michael noticed Jennifer wanted to say more, but Richard's authoritarian attitude intimidated her. She stood frozen in the hallway, clearly uneasy about the situation, but lacking the courage to confront the head of security directly. The security office was a small claustrophobic space, with monitors displaying footage from cameras around the complex. Richard shoved Michael into a chair and stood over him, clearly relishing the power. He believed he'd gained. Now we'll talk properly, Richard said, crossing his arms. Who are you really and what are you doing here? Michael weighed his options once more. He could keep trying to maintain his mission's secrecy, but the situation had deteriorated beyond any chance of discreet recovery. Alternatively, he could reveal his identity and settle everything immediately, though that meant admitting his surprise inspection had failed. I'm exactly who I said I am, Michael replied. Michael Johnson, business consultant. So I'm here at the request of a partner institution to evaluate management procedures. Partner institution? Richard laughed. What partner institution? You came in here trying to pull some scam, and now you're spinning tales to get out of it. Richard's prejudice had hardened to the point where no rational explanation could break through his mental resistance. Michael recognized this behavioral pattern from his military psychology studies. Richard had constructed a narrative that protected his worldview, and any contradictory evidence would be automatically rejected. Fine, Michael sighed. If you don't believe me, let me make one call. A single call that will clear everything up. "You're not making any calls," Richard said flatly. "First, we'll wait for the corporate supervisor to arrive. He'll decide what to do with you." Michael Johnson felt his first real moment of concern, not for his physical safety, but for the complications this situation could create. If the story leaked to the press, it could be an embarrassment for the US Army. Even worse, it could negatively impact the Civil Training Center, which, despite the obvious problems with its security staff, provided important services. "How long? Until the supervisor arrives?" Michael asked. "About 2 hours," Richard Thompson replied with a sly smile. "Plenty of time for you to rethink your stories and tell the truth." 2 hours, Michael calculated in his head. His schedule had an important meeting at 3 in the afternoon at the military base. If he didn't show up or make contact, his subordinates would surely start procedures to locate him. That could create an even more awkward situation for everyone involved. "Richard," Michael tried a more personal approach, "can I ask how long you've worked here?" 10 years, Richard answered proudly. 10 years keeping this place safe from people like you." "People like me?" Michael kept his tone calm, but there was an underlying tension in his voice. "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Richard realized he'd said something that could be interpreted as prejudiced. He quickly tried to backtrack without admitting his true thoughts. "People who try to deceive security," he said. "People who make up stories to get in where they don't belong." "I see," Michael nodded slowly. "And in your 10 years of experience, how often have you encountered people trying to deceive security the way you believe I am?" The question caught Richard off guard. Michael was using his military interrogation experience to gently expose the contradictions in the guard's reasoning. "That's irrelevant," Richard replied, clearly uncomfortable. "Of course it's relevant," Michael pressed. "If my behavior is as suspicious as you claim, you must have dealt with similar situations before. Or maybe there are other factors influencing your judgment." Richard was starting to feel cornered by Michael's logic. The articulate, intelligent way the handcuffed man argued didn't match the image of a scammer he'd built in his mind. It created a cognitive dissonance that made him increasingly irritated. "You talk a good game," Richard admitted reluctantly, "but that doesn't change the fact that you couldn't prove you had authorization to be here." "I couldn't prove it because you refused to let me use the means to do so," Michael countered. "There's a difference between not having authorization and not having the opportunity to prove it." That logical distinction hit Richard like a direct critique of his procedure. He realized, even if subconsciously, that he'd made a snap judgment based on first impressions and was now defending it to protect his ego. "Listen here," Richard leaned over Michael in an intimidating manner. "I'm not going to sit here listening to speeches. You're here because you earned it, and you'll stay until the supervisor decides what to do." Michael recognized he'd reached a limit in Richard's psychology. Pushing further might lead to unnecessary escalation. He decided to change tactics. "All right, Richard, I'll wait for the supervisor," Michael said calmly. "But I'd like you to consider one thing. What if you're wrong? What if I really am who I say I am? How would you handle that possibility?" The question planted a small seed of doubt in Richard's mind. It was exactly the kind of challenge Michael used with military subordinates who made hasty decisions, not a direct accusation, but an invitation to reflect. "I'm not wrong," Richard answered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Maybe not," Michael Johnson agreed diplomatically. "But a good security professional always considers all possibilities, right?" Richard Thompson didn't respond, but Michael could see his words were having some effect. The seed of doubt had been planted, even if it hadn't yet sprouted. As they waited in tense silence, Michael reflected on the bigger picture. This experience was giving him valuable insight into how racial bias operated in professional settings. As a general, he rarely faced direct discrimination, shielded by his rank and the automatic respect it commanded. But now, without that protection, he was experiencing the reality many Black Americans face daily. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had come to inspect possible racial discrimination, and now he was falling victim to the very issue he was investigating. In a way, he was gathering more valuable evidence than any formal inspection could provide. After about 40 increasingly uncomfortable minutes of waiting, the office door opened. A man around 50 years old entered, dressed in a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. His graying hair and formal posture suggested he was the corporate supervisor Richard had mentioned. "Good afternoon," the man said, glancing between Richard and Michael. "I'm William Davis, corporate security supervisor. Richard briefed me on the situation over the phone, but I'd like to hear the details directly." Michael studied William with interest. Unlike Richard, William projected professionalism and experience. His tone was polite and he showed none of the immediate prejudice Richard had displayed. "Mr. Davis," Richard began anxiously, "this individual entered the complex claiming to have authorization for inspections. When I requested documentation, he couldn't provide anything satisfactory. First, he said one thing, then changed his story, clearly suspicious." William nodded as he listened, but Michael noticed he was also observing his posture and demeanor during Richard's explanation. "I see," William said when Richard finished. "And what's your side of the story, Mr. Michael Johnson?" Michael replied with dignity. "Mr. Davis, I'm here to conduct a procedural assessment at the request of a partner institution. When I arrived, Richard approached me, and I tried to explain my situation. Unfortunately, I wasn't given a proper opportunity to verify my authorization before being detained." William studied Michael more closely. Just as Jennifer had noticed earlier, there was something about Michael's bearing and speech that didn't match the profile of someone with dishonest intentions. "What kind of assessment?" William asked. "Security management and procedural review," Michael answered honestly, "specifically related to how visitors are received and treated." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on William. If Michael was telling the truth about evaluating security procedures, then Richard had just demonstrated exactly the kind of problem such an assessment would aim to identify. "And who requested this assessment?" William pressed. Michael hesitated. Revealing that the request came from the US Army would essentially expose his true identity, rendering the entire surprise inspection pointless. But the situation had deteriorated so much that he might have no other choice. "Colonel Parker," Michael decided to reveal at least that name. "From the Regional Army Command." William visibly stiffened. Unlike Richard, he knew Colonel Parker and understood the significance of his connections to the Civil Training Center. "Colonel Parker?" William repeated. "Are you saying you're here at Colonel Parker's request?" "Yes," Michael confirmed. "An evaluation that was supposed to be discreet, which is why I didn't immediately identify myself as a military representative." Richard noticed the conversation was shifting and not in his favor. William clearly recognized Colonel Parker's name in a way he himself hadn't. "Mr. William," Richard interjected, "he's already made up several different stories. First, he said he was a business consultant. Now he's talking about a colonel and the US Army. It's obvious he's lying." William raised his hand to silence Richard and turned his attention back to Michael. "Mr. Michael, if you're really here at Colonel Parker's request, why didn't you say so from the start?" "Because the effectiveness of a procedural evaluation depends on observing natural behavior," Michael explained. "If I immediately identified myself as a military representative, you'd change your standard behavior and the evaluation would be compromised." Michael's explanation was flawless, and William recognized it at once. As an experienced corporate security professional, he fully understood the methodology of surprise evaluations. "That makes sense," William admitted. "But understand our position too. We're responsible for the security of this facility." "I completely understand," Michael nodded. "And I don't blame you for verifying my identity. What I question are the methods used and the refusal to let me prove my authorization." William looked at Richard, who was clearly uncomfortable with how the conversation was going. "Richard, did you give Mr. Michael a proper chance to verify his identity?" He didn't have military documentation," Richard stammered. "And his stories didn't add up." "The stories fit perfectly," Michael calmly corrected. "I really am a business consultant. It's my registered civilian profession. And I really am here to evaluate procedures at a military institution's request. There's no contradiction. William was starting to see there was a serious procedural issue. The way Richard had handled the situation was beginning to seem hasty and potentially discriminatory. "Mr. Michael," William said, "I'd like to verify your story by contacting Colonel Parker. Do you have a direct number where we can reach him?" "I do," Michael replied. "But I'd like to request the handcuffs be removed first. I pose no threat, and this situation has already gone on longer than reasonable." William looked at Richard, who reluctantly removed the handcuffs. Michael rubbed his wrists where the marks from the metal were still visible. "Thank you," Michael said with dignity. "Colonel Parker's number is—" Michael provided the colonel's direct number, which William carefully noted. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Richard realized his version of events was being questioned, and it made him increasingly nervous. "I'll call right now," William said, picking up his phone. "William," Richard tried to intervene, "don't you think we should be more careful? What if this is some kind of elaborate scam?" "Richard," William replied firmly, "a scammer wouldn't give us the direct number of a US Army colonel we can verify in minutes." "Use logic." William dialed the number and waited. After a few seconds, someone answered on the other end. "Colonel Parker, this is William Davis from the Civil Training Center." "Yes, sir." "Colonel, I have a Mr. Michael Johnson here who claims to be conducting an evaluation at your request." Michael could hear the colonel's voice on the other end, though he couldn't make out the exact words. William listened for a few minutes, asking occasional questions and confirming details. "I understand, Colonel." "Yes, sir." "I deeply regret what happened. We'll resolve this immediately." "Yes, sir, he's fine." William hung up the phone and looked at Michael with an expression that mixed embarrassment and respect. "Mr. Johnson," William said formally, "on behalf of the Civil Training Center, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Colonel Parker has confirmed your identity and the nature of your mission here." Richard visibly paled. The reality of his mistake was beginning to sink in. But he never said he was military," Richard tried to defend himself. "Because he wasn't supposed to," William explained patiently. "It was a surprise inspection, exactly what he tried to tell you from the start." Michael remained calm but carefully observed both men's reactions. Richard was clearly panicking, starting to grasp the potential consequences of his actions. William, on the other hand, was trying to contain the damage and find a diplomatic solution. "Mr. Johnson," William continued, "the colonel mentioned you hold a specific military rank we should be aware of." Michael hesitated. Revealing his rank now would be a devastating blow to Richard, who was already visibly shaken. But William needed to understand the gravity of the mistake that had been made. "I'm a general," Michael said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard seemed to stop breathing for a moment, while William closed his eyes as if processing a nightmare. "General?" William repeated, as if needing to confirm he'd heard correctly. "General Michael Johnson," Michael confirmed. "I oversee the regional military base and occasionally conduct inspections at institutions serving the US Army." Richard slumped heavily into a chair. The reality that he had handcuffed and detained a general of the US Army was beginning to penetrate his stunned mind. "My God," William murmured. "General, we have no words to express." "William," Michael gently interrupted, "I understand this is difficult for everyone. What matters now is how we move forward." Michael's maturity and diplomacy in that moment stood in stark contrast to the treatment he'd received from Richard. William noticed the difference and felt even more embarrassed by his subordinate's behavior. "General," William said respectfully, "what would you like us to do to make this right?" Michael considered the question carefully. His first instinct was to downplay the incident to spare everyone further embarrassment, but he also recognized that Richard's behavior represented a serious issue that couldn't simply be ignored. "First," Michael said, "I'd like to complete my inspection. Ironically, this incident has provided valuable insights into this institution's security procedures." William nodded quickly, clearly willing to agree to any reasonable request. "Second," Michael continued, "we need to have a serious discussion about diversity training and proper identity verification protocols. Absolutely, William agreed. We'll implement any changes you deem necessary. Michael looked at Richard, who sat with his head down, clearly devastated by the realization of whom he had detained. "Richard," Michael called gently. Richard reluctantly lifted his head, his eyes red, and his expression one of utter defeat. "Yes, General," he murmured. "Look at me," Michael said firmly, but without aggression. Richard obeyed, forcing himself to meet the gaze of the man he had humiliated. "Cycle de Casa, you made serious mistakes today," Michael said. "But I want you to understand that your career doesn't have to end here. We all make mistakes. What defines a person is how they learn and grow from them." Richard didn't expect mercy. Much less words of encouragement. Michael's generosity only deepened his shame and regret. "General, I don't know what to say," Richard stammered. I assumed." "You assumed based on prejudice." Michael finished the sentence kindly but firmly. "And now you have the chance to acknowledge that and change." Michael's words hit Richard like a punch to the gut, but they also offered a path to redemption. It was a far more effective approach than any punishment could be. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It helps us creators a lot. Now, back to the story. William watched the interaction between Michael and Richard with growing admiration. The way the general handled the situation showed exceptional leadership. Instead of seeking revenge or harsh punishment, he was turning the moment into a learning opportunity. "General," William said, "how should we proceed with disciplinary measures?" "That depends on Richard," Michael replied, still looking at the guard. "Richard, are you willing to participate in a training program on diversity and proper security procedures?" Richard nodded vigorously, clearly relieved. He wasn't being fired on the spot. "Yes, General, whatever you think is necessary." "And do you acknowledge that your prejudices influenced your judgment today?" This was the hardest question. Admitting racial bias was something Richard had avoided his whole life, even when it was obvious to everyone around him. But now, faced with the devastating consequences of his actions, he had no choice but to be honest. "Yes," Richard said quietly. "I admit I judged you by the color of your skin, not by your merits or words." It was the first time Richard had ever voiced his prejudice so directly. The admission was painful, but also strangely freeing. "Thank you for your honesty," Michael said. "That acknowledgement is the first step toward real change." William was impressed by the emotional maturity Michael displayed. Many people in his position would have sought revenge or maximum punishment. Instead, Michael was turning a potentially destructive incident into an opportunity for growth and education. "General," William said, "I'd like to discuss how we can implement systemic changes to our security procedures to prevent situations like this from happening again." "Excellent suggestion," Michael agreed. "But first, I'd like to complete my original assessment. I need to speak with other staff and observe more procedures." "Of course, General. I can personally accompany you to ensure there are no further misunderstandings." Michael considered the offer. On one hand, having William by his side would guarantee no further issues. On the other, it would completely alter the nature of his assessment, as all employees would behave differently under their supervisor's watch. "Thank you for the offer, William, but I'd prefer to continue discreetly. What happened today was exceptional, and I don't believe it will repeat." "Are you sure, General? After what happened, I'm sure." Michael smiled slightly. "In fact, today's incident gave me valuable insights a formal inspection never would have revealed." William understood the point. A surprise evaluation only worked if it remained a surprise. "Understood. But I'd ask that you reach out to me immediately if any other issues arise." "I will," Michael promised. Michael Johnson stood up, adjusted his jacket, and prepared to leave the security room. Before exiting, he turned once more to Richard. "Thompson, Richard, our conversation today doesn't end here. I expect to see you at the training program, and I expect to see real changes in your attitude and behavior." "Yes, General. I won't let you down." "It's not me you shouldn't let down," Michael corrected gently. "It's yourself and the people you serve in this role." Michael left the security room with the same dignity he had carried when entering the building that morning. The difference was that now his presence was known to at least a few people, which would change the dynamics of his evaluation. As he walked through the halls, Michael reflected on the morning's events. The incident with Richard had been embarrassing and frustrating, but also revealing. It had confirmed his suspicions about racial bias within the institution, yet it also showed that the issue could be addressed constructively. Jennifer, the administrative employee who had witnessed his detainment, approached him in the hallway. "Mr. Johnson," she called hesitantly. Michael stopped and turned to her. "Yes? I wanted to apologize for what happened," Jennifer said nervously. "I knew something was wrong with how Richard was treating you, but I didn't have the courage to intervene more directly." "Jennifer, isn't it?" Michael asked kindly. "Yes, sir." "Jennifer, you have no reason to apologize. Recognizing that something was wrong already shows good judgment, and your attempt to question Richard didn't go unnoticed." Jennifer seemed slightly relieved, but still carried a weight of guilt. "I could have done more," she insisted. "Perhaps," Michael agreed, "but now you have the opportunity to do more. If you witness similar situations in the future, I hope you'll feel more confident to act." "What can I do to help?" Jennifer asked. Her question gave Michael an idea. He was looking for ways to assess the institutional culture more broadly, and Jennifer could be a valuable source of insight. "Actually, there is something you can help me with," Michael said. "I'd like to talk to you about your experience working here. Your observations on how different types of visitors are treated would be very valuable." "Of course," Jennifer agreed immediately. "I've worked here for 8 years, and I've seen many interesting situations." "Perfect. Can we talk now, or would you prefer to schedule a time later?" "Now is fine for me if it's fine for you." Michael and Jennifer found an empty meeting room where they could speak privately. Jennifer was initially nervous, but Michael's gentle and professional approach soon put her at ease. "Jennifer, I'd like you to tell me about your experience here, especially regarding how different visitors are treated," Michael began. "Well," Jennifer hesitated at first, "it's a delicate subject. I understand. But I can assure you our conversation is confidential, and I'm here precisely to identify and correct problems. Your honesty can only help improve the situation." Jennifer took a deep breath and decided to be frank. "What happened to you today? Wasn't the first time I've seen something like that," she admitted. "Richard and a few other guards tend to treat black visitors with more suspicion than white visitors. Can you give me specific examples?" "Last week, a black businessman came in for a scheduled meeting. Even with the meeting confirmed, Richard insisted on escorting him personally to the room, as if he didn't trust him to find his way alone. That same day, a white man with no scheduled appointment was able to roam the building freely for nearly an hour before anyone questioned him." Michael made mental notes. Jennifer was confirming a pattern of discriminatory behavior, not an isolated incident. "And have you reported these observations to anyone?" "I tried mentioning it to William once, but he said Richard was just being cautious about security," Jennifer explained. "I didn't feel like my concern was taken seriously." "I see. Do other employees share your observations?" "Some do, but most prefer not to get involved. Richard has a lot of power here, and people are afraid of causing trouble for themselves." Michael recognized this pattern. It was common in organizations where prejudice had become so normalized that it was part of the institutional culture. People acknowledged the problem but felt powerless to change it. "Jennifer, do you think the situation could improve with proper training and changes in procedures?" "Absolutely," Jennifer replied with conviction. "Most people here are good people. They just need guidance and leadership to do better." "Great. And would you be willing to join a committee to develop new procedures and training programs?" "Of course," Jennifer responded enthusiastically. "It would be an honor to help make things better." Michael was impressed by Jennifer's positive attitude. She was exactly the kind of person who could be an agent of positive change in the organization. "Excellent. I'll make sure you're included in the discussions about improvements." After speaking with Jennifer for a few more minutes, Michael decided to continue his assessment by visiting other departments. He wanted to observe how employees in different areas of the complex interacted with visitors. His next stop was the Human Resources Department. As the area responsible for personnel policies and training, it would be important to understand how they approached diversity and inclusion issues. The HR department was located on the second floor of the building. Michael took the stairs and found a young receptionist, seemingly in her early 20s, seated behind a modern counter. "Good morning," Michael greeted politely. "Good morning," the receptionist replied with a genuine smile. "How can I help you?" Michael noticed that, unlike Richard, the receptionist showed no immediate suspicion or defensive behavior. Her attitude was professional and welcoming. "I'd like to speak with someone in the department about employee training procedures," Michael explained. "Of course, do you have an appointment, or is this a general inquiry?" "It's a general inquiry, but it's related to important issues." "For the organization," Michael replied. "Perfect. The HR director, Dr. Pamela, is available now. Shall I check if she can see you?" "That would be great, thank you." The receptionist called the internal phone and spoke briefly with someone. "Dr. Pamela can see you now. It's the second door on the right." Michael thanked her and followed the directions. He knocked lightly on the indicated door. "Come in," came a woman's voice from inside. Michael entered and found a woman around 45 with graying hair tied in an elegant bun, wearing a navy blue blazer. She rose from her desk to greet him. "Good morning, I'm Pamela Wilson, HR Director. How can I help you?" "Good morning, Dr. Pamela. My name is Michael Johnson, and I'd like to discuss issues related to diversity training and safety procedures." Pamela gestured for Michael to sit in a chair across from her desk. "What kind of issues specifically?" she asked, showing genuine interest. Michael decided to be direct but diplomatic. "I've noticed some inconsistencies in safety procedures that suggest a need for additional training in diversity and inclusion." Pamela leaned slightly forward, her expression growing more serious. "Could you elaborate on these inconsistencies?" "Visitors from different ethnic backgrounds seem to receive different treatment from the security team," Michael explained carefully. "This suggests the need for more standardized procedures and unconscious bias training." Pamela sighed softly, as if this weren't the first time she'd heard about such an issue. "Unfortunately, you're not the first person to notice this," she admitted. "We've already received some informal complaints about the behavior of certain security team members." "And what measures have been taken to address these complaints?" "We've tried speaking informally with the security supervisor, but we haven't implemented systematic changes yet," Pamela admitted with some embarrassment. "I recognize we should have done more." Michael appreciated Pamela's honesty. Unlike William, who had been caught off guard by the problem, Pamela was clearly aware of the situation and acknowledged the need for action. "Dr. Pamela, may I ask about your background in human resources?" "I have a master's in people management and several certifications in diversity and inclusion," she replied. "I know exactly what kind of programs we need to implement. The challenge has been getting leadership support for broader changes." "What kind of resistance have you faced?" "Mainly the mindset of, we've always done it this way, and that changes are unnecessary," Pamela explained. "Some leadership members see diversity programs as politically correct rather than legitimate operational needs." Michael recognized this pattern of resistance. It was common in organizations where diversity issues were seen as political rather than matters of operational effectiveness and legal compliance. "And if there were proper leadership support, what kind of program would you implement?" Pamela's eyes lit up. It was clear she had thought extensively about this issue. "We'd start with mandatory unconscious bias training for the entire security team and supervisors. Then we'd implement clear, standardized procedures for interacting with visitors, focusing on equitable treatment regardless of ethnic background or appearance." "Would that include clear consequences for violating the procedures?" "Absolutely. Without consequences, procedures are just suggestions," Pamela agreed firmly. Michael was impressed by Pamela's competence and knowledge. It was clear she knew exactly what needed to be done, but had been held back by a lack of organizational support. "Dr. Pamela, what if I told you there's renewed interest from leadership in implementing these changes?" "I'd be very excited," Pamela replied without hesitation. "I could have a detailed proposal ready in a week." "Excellent. And would you be willing to work with other stakeholders, including employees who've been affected by the current issues? Of course, in fact, that would be essential for developing effective solutions. Michael was beginning to see the outline of a viable solution. Pamela had the technical expertise. Jennifer represented the perspective of employees who had observed the problems. And even Richard could be a valuable voice as someone who had personally recognized the need for change. Dr. Pamela, may I share with you that I'm General Michael Johnson, commander of the regional military base. I'm here conducting a formal evaluation at Colonel Parker's request. Pamela looked visibly surprised, but quickly composed herself. General, that explains a lot about your questions, she said, and it also significantly increases the urgency for us to implement changes. Why do you say that? Because if a U.S. Army general is conducting an assessment on diversity, it means the problem is serious enough to draw attention at the military level. That should be a wake-up call for our leadership. Michael appreciated Pamela's strategic perspective. She understood not only the technical aspects of diversity and inclusion, but also the political and organizational implications. Exactly. And I hope we can work together to turn this assessment into concrete improvements. You can count on me fully, General. After speaking with Pamela for a few more minutes about specific implementation details, Michael decided to visit other areas of the complex. He wanted a broader understanding of the organizational culture before finalizing his recommendations. His next stop was the Technical Training Department, where civilian employees received instruction in skills related to military operations. It was a critical area because it represented the direct interface between the military and civilian worlds. The training department was housed in a separate building, connected to the main facility by a covered walkway. Michael walked along the pathway, observing the complex's modern and functional architecture. Inside the training building, the atmosphere was more industrial, with technical classrooms and specialized labs. The department coordinator, a man in his 50s named Robert Anderson, was overseeing a training session when Michael arrived. "Excuse me," Michael said politely. "I'd like to speak with the person in charge of the department." Robert turned and assessed Michael briefly. Unlike Richard, and also unlike the receptionist and Pamela, Robert displayed careful professional neutrality. "I'm Robert Anderson, Technical Training Coordinator. How can I help you? I'd like to better understand how the integration between military and civilian personnel works in the training programs." Robert considered the question for a moment. "It's a complex area," he admitted. "We have to balance military standards with civilian realities. It's not always easy." "What kind of challenges do you face specifically?" "Well, military personnel are used to a very clear hierarchical structure and strict procedures. Civilian staff sometimes struggle to adapt to that level of discipline and precision." Michael noticed Robert was describing the challenges in general, neutral terms, without mentioning specific diversity or discrimination issues. "And how do you handle situations where there are conflicts or misunderstandings between participants from different backgrounds?" "We try to keep everything very professional and focused on the technical content," Robert replied. "We avoid personal matters that could cause conflict." Michael recognized this approach. It was a well-intentioned attempt to maintain neutrality, but it often resulted in ignoring underlying problems rather than addressing them constructively. "I see. But what happens when personal matters affect the learning environment or the effectiveness of the training?" Robert seemed uncomfortable with the question. "We handle those situations case by case," he said vaguely. "Could you give me an example of how such a situation was handled?" Robert hesitated significantly before answering. "Well, there was an incident a few months ago where one of the civilian participants, a young black man, claimed he was being treated differently by the military instructors. We spoke with everyone involved and reinforced the importance of professionalism." "And what was the outcome?" "The participant completed the training, but I'm not sure he felt entirely satisfied with how it was resolved." Michael sensed Robert was being deliberately vague about the details, likely because the situation hadn't been handled properly. "Robert, can I speak with this participant or get more details about the case?" "That would be complicated," Robert admitted. "Privacy issues and all." Michael recognized the resistance. Robert was clearly uncomfortable discussing matters of discrimination, likely because he knew they hadn't been properly addressed. "I understand your concerns about privacy," Michael said diplomatically, "but I want to assure you, I'm here to help improve situations like this, not to cause trouble." Robert studied Michael more carefully, as if trying to gauge his true intentions. "May I ask what exactly your interest is in these matters?" Robert inquired. Michael decided it was time to reveal his identity. Robert seemed like a reasonable person who was being cautious for legitimate reasons. "I'm General Michael Johnson, commander of the regional military base. I'm conducting a comprehensive evaluation of diversity and inclusion procedures at this institution." The shift in Robert's expression was dramatic. He instantly went from cautious to highly attentive and respectful. "General," Robert said, instinctively straightening up, "my apologies, I didn't know who you were." "No need to apologize. Robert, in fact, your initial caution shows professionalism. Now, can we speak more openly about the challenges you're facing?" "Of course, General. How can I assist?" "First, I'd like to hear your honest assessment of how diversity issues affect the effectiveness of the training programs." Robert took a deep breath, clearly reorganizing his thoughts now that he knew who he was speaking to. "Well, General, honestly, we do have some challenges," he admitted. "Some of the more senior military instructors sometimes struggle to adjust to the increasing diversity of civilian participants, and some civilian participants feel they're being judged by factors beyond their technical competence." "Does this affect the quality of training?" "Yes, definitely. When there's tension or discomfort, learning is compromised for everyone." Michael appreciated Robert's honesty now that he felt safe to speak openly. "And what kind of support have you received from administration to address these challenges?" "Very little, unfortunately," Robert admitted. "We've always been told to keep things professional, but we've never received real training on how to handle diversity or inclusion situations." "Do you think specific training would help?" "Absolutely. For both instructors and participants, everyone would benefit from clear guidance on behavioral expectations and how to create a more inclusive learning environment." Michael was seeing a consistent pattern. In every department he visited, he found well-meaning people who recognized problems but hadn't received the necessary organizational support to address them effectively. "Robert, would you be willing to work with other departments to develop and implement diversity training programs?" "It would be an honor, General. I'm convinced it would significantly improve the quality of our programs." "Excellent. I'll make sure you're included in the implementation discussions." Michael spent a few more minutes talking with Robert about specific details of the training programs before deciding to visit his next stop, the Institutional Relations Department. The Institutional Relations Department was responsible for managing partnerships between the Civil Training Center and other organizations, including private companies and other military institutions. Michael was interested in understanding how diversity issues affected these external relationships. The department director, Barbara Miller, was a woman of about 55 with an impressive executive presence. She greeted Michael in an elegant office decorated with photos of institutional events and partnership certificates. "Mr. Johnson, welcome," Barbara said cordially. "I understand you're interested in our institutional relations." Michael had decided to continue his approach of gradually revealing his military identity as the conversation unfolded. "Yes, specifically how diversity and inclusion issues affect those relations." Barbara seemed slightly surprised by the specific focus of the question. "That's an interesting perspective," she said. "It's not something we get many questions about, but it's definitely relevant." "How so?" "Well, some of our partner organizations have started asking about our diversity programs as part of their own partnership criteria," Barbara explained. "Especially multinational companies and organizations with public commitments to diversity and inclusion." "And how do you respond to those questions?" Barbara hesitated slightly. "Honestly, we've had to acknowledge that our programs in that area are limited," she admitted. "It has affected some partnership opportunities." "Can you give specific examples?" Recently, a major tech company was considering a partnership to train their employees here. During the due diligence process, they asked about our diversity and inclusion programs. When we couldn't provide substantive evidence that we had such programs, they decided to look elsewhere. Michael made a mental note. Diversity issues weren't just affecting the organization's internal culture, but also its external competitiveness. Is this a pattern you've observed? Unfortunately, yes. The corporate world is increasingly focused on diversity and inclusion, and organizations that don't demonstrate commitment in this area are being left behind. And how has leadership responded when you've reported these missed opportunities? There's recognition that we need to do something, but we haven't seen concrete action yet, Barbara said diplomatically. Michael understood Barbara was being careful not to directly criticize leadership, but her message was clear. There was awareness of the problem, but a lack of effective action. Barbara, may I share that I'm General Michael Johnson, and I'm conducting a comprehensive evaluation of this institution at the request of the U.S. Army Command. Barbara, visibly startled, and quickly adjusted her posture. General, my apologies, I didn't know your identity, she said. Clearly concerned she might have said something inappropriate. No need to apologize. In fact, your observations are very valuable. I gather the lack of diversity programs is affecting not just internal culture, but also the organization's external opportunities. Yes, General, it's both a reputational and competitive issue. Partner organizations are increasingly demanding proof of commitment to diversity and inclusion. And do you have specific recommendations on how to address this? Absolutely. We need to develop substantive programs, not just policies on paper. And we need to communicate these programs effectively to our current and potential partners. Michael was seeing yet another dimension of the problem. Diversity wasn't just a moral or legal issue. It was a strategic one, affecting the organization's competitive viability. Barbara, would you be willing to contribute to developing a comprehensive diversity strategy that meets both internal needs and external partner expectations? Absolutely, General. I have several ideas about how we can position the organization to be more competitive in this area. After speaking with Barbara for a few more minutes about specific aspects of external relations, Michael Johnson decided he had gathered enough information to form a comprehensive understanding of the situation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. It was noon, and Michael decided to take a break for lunch and reflection before continuing his assessment. There was a cafeteria in the complex where employees and visitors could eat, and Michael thought it would be a good opportunity to observe informal interactions. The cafeteria was a spacious, modern area with tables for 4 to 6 people and a variety of food options. Michael picked up a tray and chose a simple meal, then looked for a place to sit where he could discreetly observe the surroundings. As he ate, Michael noticed the social dynamics in the cafeteria. There was an obvious informal segregation. Military personnel tended to sit together, white civilian employees formed another group, and the few black civilian employees often ate, alone or in very small groups. This observation confirmed his suspicions about deeper integration issues within the organization. It wasn't just a matter of a few prejudiced individuals, but a systematic pattern of social segregation. While observing, Michael noticed a young black man, apparently in his 20s, sitting alone at a nearby table. The young man was eating quickly and seemed eager to finish and leave the cafeteria. Michael decided to approach him. "Excuse me," Michael said politely. "May I sit here?" The young man looked up, surprised. It was unusual for someone to ask to share a table with him. "Sure," he replied hesitantly. Michael sat down and extended his hand. "Michael Johnson, nice to meet you." "Tyrone Jackson," the young man answered, shaking the offered hand. "Are you new here? I'm visiting for a few days. Have you worked here long?" "About 6 months," Tyrone replied. "I'm an intern in the technical department." Michael noticed that Tyrone seemed slightly nervous, as if he wasn't used to casual conversations with strangers. "How has your experience been here?" Michael asked gently. Tyrone hesitated, clearly weighing how much it was safe to be honest with a stranger. "It's a learning experience," he said diplomatically. Michael recognized the careful wording of someone who had learned to navigate potentially hostile environments. "What kind of learning, specifically?" Tyrone studied Michael's face. For a moment, as if trying to decide whether he could trust him. "Technical learning, of course," Tyrone said, "but also learning how to function in places where you're not always welcome." Tyrone's honesty surprised Michael. It was clear the young man had decided to trust, at least partly, his intuition about Michael. "Could you elaborate on that?" Tyrone glanced around the cafeteria to make sure no one else was listening. "Look, I don't want to speak badly about anyone in particular," Tyrone said quietly, "but sometimes it's hard when you feel like you have to work twice as hard just to be accepted, you know." Michael understood perfectly. It was an experience he had lived himself, though his military rank usually shielded him from direct displays of prejudice. "Can you give me an example?" "Well, when I first started, I was assigned to work with one of the senior technicians on an important project. On the first day, he gave me basic filing and cleaning tasks, even though he knew I had relevant technical training. It took weeks for him to give me responsibilities that matched my qualifications. And do you think this was related to prejudice?" "It's hard to say for sure," Tyrone admitted, "but other interns who started around the same time were given more significant responsibilities right from the beginning." Michael made a mental note of yet another example of unequal treatment. Tyrone seemed like an intelligent and thoughtful person, not someone prone to making baseless accusations. "How did you handle that situation?" "I worked twice as hard to prove my competence," Tyrone said. "Eventually my work spoke for itself and now I have more responsibilities, but that extra effort shouldn't have been necessary." Michael admired Tyrone's maturity and determination. Despite the challenges, he had found a way to thrive. "Tyrone, may I ask what motivated you to take this internship, considering the difficulties?" "The experience here is very valuable for my career," Tyrone explained. "And honestly, I hope that contributing to operations related to the US Army could open doors to future opportunities." "Are you interested in a military career?" "I've always considered it. I deeply admire the values of discipline, honor, and service that the Army represents." Michael was moved by Tyrone's answer. Here was a young man who, despite facing discrimination, still held respect and admiration for military institutions. "Tyrone, may I share something with you? I'm General Michael Johnson, commander of the regional military base." Tyrone nearly knocked over his water glass. "General?" he whispered, his eyes widening. "Yes, and I'm here conducting an assessment on diversity and inclusion issues. Your perspective is extremely valuable to me." Tyrone seemed stunned for a moment, processing the information. "I don't know what to say, General. I hope I haven't said anything inappropriate." "On the contrary, you spoke with the honesty and maturity I expect from all our team members, regardless of their position." Tyrone seemed slightly more at ease, but was still clearly in awe. "General, may I ask you a question?" "Of course. Have you ever faced similar situations during your military career?" It was a sharp question that showed Tyrone was thinking beyond his own experience. "Yes, especially early in my career," Michael admitted. "The difference is that, as I moved up in rank, my position offered some protection against overt prejudice, but I know many black service members in lower ranks still face challenges like yours. How did you handle it?" "Much like you, actually. I worked harder to prove my ability, sought out mentors who supported me, and gradually built a reputation based on results. But I also learned the importance of creating opportunities for others facing similar challenges." Tyrone nodded, clearly absorbing Michael's words. "Is that why you're doing this assessment?" "Exactly. I want to ensure that organizations affiliated with the Army provide fair opportunities for everyone, regardless of ethnicity or any other factor irrelevant to professional competence." "Does that mean changes might be coming?" "It means I'm committed to working toward implementing changes that benefit people like you and improve the organization's overall effectiveness." Tyrone smiled for the first time during their conversation. "That would be amazing, General. So much." Potential is wasted here because of unnecessary prejudice. I couldn't agree more, and I'd like to invite you to participate in developing solutions. Your perspective as a young professional would be invaluable. It would be an honor, General. Michael Johnson finished his lunch feeling more motivated than ever to implement meaningful changes. His conversation with Tyrone had personalized the abstract problems he had identified that morning. After lunch, Michael decided to make one last stop before beginning to draft his recommendations. He wanted to speak again with William, the security supervisor, to better understand his perspective on the morning's events and his willingness to implement changes. Michael found William in his office, reviewing security reports. William stood up immediately when Michael entered. "General, how can I help you?" "William, I'd like to discuss this morning's events and go over next steps." "Of course, General. I want to apologize again for what happened. I've already started a full review of our security procedures." Michael noticed that William seemed genuinely committed to addressing the issues. "I appreciate your proactive attitude, William. Can you share your initial assessment of the situation?" "Honestly, General, I recognize we failed in several areas. Richard acted based on bias. Our procedures weren't clear enough to prevent this, and I personally failed to identify and address problematic patterns earlier." Michael was impressed by William's honest self-evaluation. "And what measures do you propose to address these failures?" "First, mandatory diversity training for the entire security team. Second, a full review of procedures to ensure fair treatment of all visitors. Third, a feedback system where visitors can report issues without fear of retaliation." Those are solid proposals. What about Richard specifically? William hesitated slightly. Richard made serious mistakes, but he also showed the ability to recognize his problems and a commitment to change. I believe with proper training and close supervision, he could become an example of positive transformation. Michael appreciated William's balanced approach. He wasn't trying to downplay the severity of Richard's mistakes, but also acknowledged potential for growth. "I agree with your assessment. Personal transformation can be more effective than simple punishment, as long as it's supported by systemic changes." "Exactly, General. And I want to assure you we'll implement changes that go beyond individual cases." "William, would you be willing to work with other departments to develop a comprehensive diversity and inclusion approach?" "Absolutely. I recognize security is just one part of the bigger problem." Michael was satisfied with William's attitude. It was clear the supervisor understood both the need for change and the importance of a coordinated effort. "Excellent. I'll be in touch with you and other department leaders to coordinate efforts." After his conversation with William, Michael decided he had gathered enough information to formulate comprehensive recommendations. He found an empty office where he could work in peace to organize his observations and develop an action plan. Michael spent the next 2 hours systematizing his findings. The issues he had identified were more extensive than he initially expected, but he had also found valuable human resources in every department he visited. His findings included: 1. Systematic bias in the security team, exemplified by Richard's behavior. 2. Lack of formal diversity and inclusion programs across the organization. Informal social segregation between different demographic groups. 4. Missed partnership opportunities due to the absence of diversity programs. 5. Wasted talent. Potential as seen in Tyrone's experience. 6. Presence of competent leaders willing to implement changes across various departments. Michael also identified resources for solutions. 1. Pamela, HR, technical expertise in diversity and inclusion. 2. Jennifer, administration, employee perspective and willingness to contribute. 3. Robert, technical training, recognition of issues and desire for solutions. 4. Barbara, institutional relations, understanding of strategic implications. 5. William, security, commitment to change after recognizing problems. 6. Tyrone, intern, perspective of someone directly affected by the issues. 7. Richard, security, potential example of personal transformation. Based on these findings, Michael developed a phased implementation plan. Phase 1, 30 days, immediate actions. Mandatory unconscious bias training for the entire security. Team, review and standardization of security procedures, establishment of an interdepartmental diversity committee, implementation of a visitor feedback system. Phase 2, 90 days. Comprehensive programs. Diversity training for all employees, development of formal diversity and inclusion policies, creation of mentorship programs for underrepresented employee groups, establishment of metrics to monitor progress. Phase 3, 180 days. Strategic integration. Incorporation of diversity into performance evaluation criteria, development of marketing materials, emphasizing commitment to diversity, establishment of partnerships with diversity-focused organizations, creation of an internship program targeting students from underrepresented groups. Michael was satisfied with his plan, but knew success would depend on the commitment of the organization's senior leadership. He decided his next step would be a meeting with the Civil Training Center's director. Michael called the director's assistant and scheduled a meeting for late afternoon. He spent the remaining time refining his presentation and preparing supporting documentation. At 4 in the afternoon, Michael headed to the director's office, located on the top floor of the main building. The director, Dr. James Robertson, was a man in his 60s with a distinguished appearance and a reputation for effective leadership. General Johnson, Dr. Robertson stood to greet Michael. "It's an honor to have you at our institution. Dr. Robertson, thank you for meeting me on such short notice. I understand you've conducted a thorough assessment of our operations today. I'm eager to hear your observations." Michael noticed Dr. Robertson seemed genuinely interested in feedback, not defensive as one might expect from someone about to receive criticism about their organization. "Dr. Robertson, my findings are mixed. I've identified significant issues requiring immediate attention, but I've also found exceptional human resources that make solutions highly feasible. Please be specific about both aspects." Michael spent the next 20 minutes presenting his findings clearly and objectively, providing specific examples without naming names when appropriate. Dr. Robertson listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "General, your findings don't entirely surprise me," Dr. Robertson admitted when Michael finished. "I've had indications we have issues in this area, but I didn't have such a comprehensive understanding of their extent. And what's your assessment of the feasibility of implementing meaningful changes? Based on your presentation, I believe it's not only feasible, but essential for our future competitiveness," Dr. Robertson replied firmly. "The implications for our external relations alone would justify significant action." Michael was encouraged by Dr. Robertson's response. "Dr. Robertson, I've developed a 3-phase implementation plan I'd like to discuss with you." Michael presented his detailed plan, explaining the reasoning behind each phase and the proposed metrics to measure success. "It's a comprehensive and well-structured plan," Dr. Robertson remarked. "What kind of support would you recommend from military command?" "Primarily supervision and guidance during implementation. It would also be beneficial to have access to military diversity specialists to complement civilian expertise. That can be arranged. What about financial resources?" "Most proposed actions can be implemented with existing resources, mainly through reallocating time and priorities. Additional costs would mainly be for specialized training and educational materials." Dr. Robertson nodded, clearly pleased with the plan's financial feasibility. "General, you have my full commitment to implement these changes. When can we begin?" "I suggest we establish the Interdepartmental Diversity Committee next week. That will create immediate momentum and demonstrate organizational commitment." "Perfect. And would you be willing to serve as an advisor during the implementation process?" "Certainly. I see this as an important investment in the future of our military-civilian collaboration." Michael left the meeting with Dr. Robertson feeling optimistic about the prospects for meaningful change. He had senior leadership support, capable human resources in each department, and a viable implementation plan. His final task of the day was one last meeting with Richard. Michael wanted to ensure the security officer understood both the gravity of his actions and the opportunities for personal growth. Michael found Richard waiting nervously in the security office. The man seemed to have aged years in a single day. "General," Richard stood quickly when Michael entered. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me again." "Richard, how are you feeling about today's events?" "Ashamed, General. Deeply ashamed. I've spent all day rethinking not just what happened with you, but other similar incidents I now realize were influenced by the same biases." Michael appreciated Richard's genuine reflection. "And what have you learned from this reflection?" "That I let biases I didn't even know I had influence my professional judgment, and that I hurt innocent people because of it." "That's an important acknowledgement, Richard. What do you plan to do with this awareness?" "I want to do better, General. Not just attend whatever training is offered, but truly change my perspective and behavior. This won't be easy. Genuine change requires consistent and sometimes uncomfortable effort." "I understand, General, but after today I can't pretend I don't know better." Michael studied Richard for a moment. He saw genuine signs of remorse and determination to change. "Richard, I'd like to make a proposal. I want you to become one of the leaders in the diversity training program we'll implement. Your experience recognizing and changing personal biases would be valuable for others." Richard looked visibly surprised. "General, I'm not sure I'm the right person to lead others after what I've done." "Richard, sometimes those who've grown the most through an experience are the most effective at helping others avoid the same mistakes." It would be an honor, General, but I want to make sure I've truly changed before trying to help others." "That's exactly the attitude that makes me believe you can be effective in this role." Michael spent a few more minutes discussing specific expectations and next steps with Richard before preparing to leave the complex. It was nearly 6 in the evening when Michael finally walked to his car in the parking lot. It had been a long and emotionally intense day, but also a very productive one. As he drove back to the military base, Michael reflected on the day's events. He had started the morning expecting to conduct a routine and discreet assessment. Instead, he had personally experienced the issues he had come to investigate, but he had also uncovered unexpected opportunities for positive change. The incident with Richard, though initially frustrating and humiliating, had turned into a catalyst for broader changes than Michael had thought possible. Sometimes, he mused, the most significant obstacles could become the most valuable opportunities. The following week, Michael returned to the Civil Training Center for the first meeting of the Interdepartmental Diversity Committee, the conference. Room was full. Pamela from HR, Jennifer from administration, Robert from technical training, Barbara from institutional relations, William from security, Tyrone as the trainee representative, and Richard as a special participant. "Good morning, everyone," Michael began. "We're here to start a process that will fundamentally transform how this organization approaches diversity and inclusion." Pamela was the first to speak. "General, I've already begun drafting training curricula based on best practices in the field. I can have pilot programs ready in 2 weeks." "Excellent. Jennifer, how has the idea been received among administrative staff?" "Very positively, General. People have been waiting for changes in this area for a long time." Robert raised his hand. "General, I've coordinated with my instructors, and they've all expressed interest in participating in the training. Some even admitted they needed guidance on how to better handle diversity in the classroom." Barbara added, "I've already started communicating our diversity initiatives to external partners. The feedback has been extremely positive. Several organizations we'd lost contact with have expressed renewed interest in partnerships." William reported, "I've implemented stricter temporary procedures for interactions with visitors, and I'm already seeing improvements." Richard has been instrumental in helping other team members understand the importance of these changes. Michael looked at Richard. "Richard, how has your experience been?" "General, I won't lie. It's been challenging confronting my own biases, but it's also been liberating. I've talked to colleagues about my experiences, and several admitted they also needed to rethink their attitudes." Tyrone, who had been relatively quiet, finally spoke. "General, I can already feel a difference in the environment. People seem more aware of their interactions, and there's more visible mutual respect." Michael was impressed by the progress in just 1 week. "You've exceeded my expectations. Let's move forward with Phase 1 implementation and start planning Phase 2. Over the next 3 months, Michael visited the center regularly to monitor progress. The changes were remarkable. The cafeteria was no longer informally segregated. Employees from different backgrounds began eating together and forming genuine relationships. The security department implemented standardized procedures that eliminated differential treatment based on appearance. Visitors reported consistently respectful experiences. The technical training department saw significant improvements in participant satisfaction and learning effectiveness as the environment became more inclusive. Institutional relations regained several lost partnerships and established new connections based on the organization's enhanced reputation for diversity. Most importantly, the organizational culture had fundamentally changed. Diversity and inclusion were no longer avoided topics, but an integral part of how the organization operated. By the end of the 3rd month, Michael organized a recognition ceremony to celebrate the progress and acknowledge exceptional individual contributions. Dr. Robertson, Michael said during the ceremony, in less than 6 months, this organization has transformed from one with significant diversity issues into a model of best practices. Dr. Robertson replied, General, the credit goes to the people in this room who had the courage to confront tough problems and work toward real solutions. Michael called each committee member forward for recognition. Pamela, your technical expertise and leadership in program development were crucial to our success. Jennifer, your courage in speaking up about the issues you observed and your dedication to supporting change have been inspiring. Robert, your willingness to adapt teaching methods and create more inclusive environments significantly improved educational effectiveness. Barbara, your strategic vision regarding external implications helped turn a problem into a competitive advantage. William, your leadership in completely overhauling safety procedures proved that meaningful organizational change is possible. Tyrone, your perspective as someone directly affected by these issues and your contributions to solutions have been invaluable. And Richard, Michael paused for a moment to emphasize his next words, your personal transformation from someone who displayed prejudice to a leader in positive change is a powerful example that genuine growth is possible. Richard stepped forward to receive his recognition with tears in his eyes. General, 6 months ago I was a different person, a worse person. You could have destroyed me that day, but instead you gave me the chance to become better. I'll never forget that lesson in true leadership. Michael embraced Richard, symbolizing the complete transformation of their relationship. Richard, you've proven that real change is possible with genuine commitment. Your journey will inspire others for years. After the ceremony, Michael had a final conversation with Dr. Robertson about the program's future. Dr. Robertson, I'm confident this organization now has the systems and culture needed to sustain and expand these improvements independently. General, we can't thank you enough for turning what could have been a destructive crisis into an opportunity for extraordinary growth. Truthfully, Dr. Robertson, I should thank you. This process has taught me as much about effective leadership as any experience in my military career. 6 months later, Michael received a special invitation. The Civil Training Center was hosting a regional conference on diversity and inclusion, and they wanted him as the keynote speaker. Michael accepted and returned to the place where it all began. The difference was striking. The complex now proudly displayed diversity certifications, photos of diverse staff in promotional materials, and an overall atmosphere of inclusion and respect. During his speech, Michael shared the story of his own experience at the center, from the initial incident with Richard to the sweeping transformation that followed. The most important lesson I learned, Michael told the audience of over 200 people from organizations across the region, is that bias and discrimination aren't unsolvable problems. They can be overcome with genuine commitment to change, effective leadership, and a willingness to do the hard work required. After his speech, Michael was approached by Richard, who now served as the regional coordinator for diversity programs. General, I wanted you to know that our story has become a case study at several universities. Students in management and leadership are learning about organizational transformation through what happened here. That's gratifying, Richard, but what's more important is the real impact on people's lives. Speaking of which, General, I'd like to introduce you to someone. Richard brought forward a young black woman around 25 years old. General, this is Dr. Keisha Washington. She's been hired as our new Director of Organizational Development, a position created specifically to expand our diversity programs. Dr. Keisha, it's a pleasure to meet you. General, the honor is mine. I've heard so much about you and the transformation of this organization. It's inspiring to work in a place that proves real change is possible. Michael spoke with Keisha for a few minutes about her plans to further expand diversity programs, then met with Tyrone, who had been promoted to a permanent full-time position. Tyrone, how has your experience been since we last spoke? Transformative, General. Not only has my career progressed, but the environment is completely different. Now I feel genuinely valued for my contributions, not just tolerated despite my background. And your future plans? Actually, General, I've decided to apply to the military academy. I want to follow in your footsteps and eventually lead positive change from within the armed forces. Michael was moved by Tyrone's decision. Tyrone, it will be an honor to have you as a fellow officer. Your experiences here have prepared you to face and overcome challenges you may encounter. Thank you for believing in me, General, and for showing that true leadership means lifting others up, not just giving orders. As Michael prepared to leave the center that evening, Jennifer approached him. General, before you go, the entire administrative team wanted to give you this. Jennifer handed Michael an engraved plaque that read, "To General Michael Johnson, whose courage to confront injustice and wisdom to turn obstacles into opportunities changed our lives forever." Jennifer, you didn't have to do this. General, we absolutely did. You taught us that we all have a responsibility to create environments where every person can thrive. It's a lesson we'll carry for the rest of our lives. As he drove home that night, Michael reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a humiliating and frustrating incident. What could have been just another example of bias and discrimination had become one of the most rewarding experiences of his career. More importantly, Michael had learned that true leadership wasn't just about commanding subordinates or completing missions. It was about recognizing opportunities to lift others up, turning obstacles into catalysts for growth, and creating positive change that extended far beyond immediate situations. The incident with Richard had initially challenged his dignity and tested his patience, but his decision to respond with wisdom and compassion instead of anger and revenge had created ripples of positive change that would continue to impact lives for years. Years later, Michael often shared this story with young officers as an example of how seemingly negative situations could be transformed into opportunities for leadership and growth. The tale of the general who was wrongfully arrested became legendary in military circles, not for the initial embarrassment, but for the extraordinary transformation that followed. Michael learned that true victory didn't come from defeating opponents, but from turning enemies into allies, prejudice into understanding, and obstacles into opportunities. It was a lesson he would carry throughout the rest of his military career and beyond. And somewhere in the United States, a civil training center continued to operate as a model of diversity and inclusion, reminding everyone who worked there daily that genuine change was always possible when there was courage to face difficult problems and wisdom to find constructive solutions. Richard's transformation, in particular, became a powerful symbol that even deeply rooted prejudices could be overcome through honest self-reflection, proper education, and a genuine commitment to change. His subsequent work as a diversity coordinator influenced hundreds of other organizations in the region to implement similar programs. Tyrone eventually became a military officer and returned to the center years later as part of an official delegation, proving that fair opportunities could truly transform lives and careers. And Michael continued to use his leadership position to create positive change, always remembering that the most transformative experience of his career had begun with a moment of vulnerability and humiliation, one he had chosen to turn into an opportunity for growth for everyone involved. History had shown that true leadership wasn't about always being in control or never facing adversity. It was about how one responded when confronted with challenges and whether they chose to use their influence to create positive changes that benefited everyone. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your sincere words in the comments. Do you think Michael made the right decision by turning humiliation into an opportunity for growth? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like the video and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories.